resume this. Okay, so we are talking about OntoUML, right? So now we're gonna start seeing how this language looks like. As I said, this is an extension of UML. So it looks at first like UML. So it looks superficially like UML. It is a valid UML model. So, but instead of having just these very general distinctions between, among relations, association, and classes, we have finer grained distinctions among, for example, different types of classes and different types of relations, right? So, for example, we make a distinction between kinds of things, right? So not all classes are the same. So kinds are types which classify things in a way that they describe essential properties of those things. So they are the things that the entities in this domain are essentially. So they describe properties that this instance must have in all possible situations. So in other words, they classify these entities necessarily in a model sense, right? They are the types that provide the identity for the things that exist in this domain. So for example, in this toy example that I'm showing here, we have 4 kinds of things. We have people and hearts and brains and organizations. So why I'm necessarily a person? I'm only contingently, accidentally a living person. In other words, everyone who's a living person in a certain moment will cease to be a living person in this conceptualization here, while maintaining their identity. So I'll still be a person, but I will move to this other class. So these are dynamic classes, being a living person or a deceased person, and for an organization being an active organization or an extinct organization. So being an organization is necessary, is essential for organizations, but being an active organization is contingent. In other words, these dynamic classes, things can move in and out of the extension of those classes without ceasing to exist, without losing their identity. Now, all these examples here are dynamic types in which the dynamic classification condition is an intrinsic one. So, for example, I become a living person or a deceased person because of some intrinsic change that happens in me. Another example, I was once a child, then I became a teenager, and then I became an adult person. And all these changes are due to intrinsic change that happened to me. Reagan, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, could you please explain the reasoning for the 2 connectors between brain and person? I see the essential and inseparable one, but the disjoint one as well.
Oh, yes. No, the disjoint is actually for all the 3 classes, right? The disjoint, so the essential inseparable, I'll come back to this later in the talk, but the disjoint is, this is even standard UML. We have what is called a generalization set.
Oh, so sorry. I was, they're all pointing to the physical object. Sorry, I was thinking that it pointed to the person. Sorry, my mistake.
Oh, okay, yes. So that's clear, right? That these are all disjoint specializations of the physical object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, good. So as I was saying, we call phases these dynamic types in which the dynamic classification condition, the contingent classification condition, is an intrinsic one. And we have dynamic types for which the dynamic classification condition is a relational one. And this is what we call roles. So again, roles are contingent types, but you move in and out of an extension of a role by changing relational properties, basically by establishing or terminating a relation. So in order to be a patient, so no patient is necessarily a patient, right? And in order to be a patient, you become a patient because you were treated by some healthcare provider, for example. Then we have types which classify things of multiple kinds. So for example, the type physical object here is a type that describes properties which are common to different physical objects of different kinds that obey different principles of identity, that ascribe different essential properties, right? So all physical objects have a spatial extension, for example, and have mass, but there isn't a common principle of identity uniformly shared by all instances of physical objects. Physical objects would include buildings and bridges and cars and watches and computers and so on. So these are types that describe properties which are common to things of multiple kinds, but which do not have enough information for their instantiation, let's say. If I could offer a geometric metaphor, things would look like this. Your universe of possible instances is tessellated into kinds. So these are the things which really exist. For example, organization, suppose K1 is person and K3 is car and so on, right? So everything belongs to one kind, one unique kind, and these borders are rigid. So things cannot move out of the limits, the borders of a kind. Everything is of one kind, one unique kind, necessarily. Again, which are the kinds of your conceptualization is up to the domain experts. The language is giving you a way to make this set of choices which are consistent among themselves, right? Sometimes we have, so suppose K2 is person. Maybe we have here a subpartition of this kind into rigid subregions. Suppose that we have biological sex and a conceptualization that assumes that this is rigid, that people cannot change biological sex. I know it's a very much more sophisticated subject, just an example. Then this region would be partitioned into subregions, and they cannot move out of the subregions because these subregions would also be rigid, and they are called subkinds. Now, phases and rows that we just saw are shadows moving within a particular region without ever crossing the boundaries of regions, classifying and declassifying things. So suppose this is person, and the red thing here is the role student. So as time goes by, things become and cease to be student. Suppose K5 is organization, and this thing is a phase of extinct organization. So different organizations become extinct or active and so on. Now, mixins, what we call mixins, are those types that cross the boundaries of kinds. So things which classify things of multiple kinds. They can be rigid, like physical objects. So all physical objects are necessarily physical objects, or they can be shadows that move across the borders of kinds, dynamically classifying and declassifying things. These are dynamic mixins, also called anti-rigid mixins. Okay. So here is a tiny piece of the ontology behind the language, right? So we have here this notion of type, which we make a distinction between what's called a sortal type. A sortal is basically either a kind or a specialization of a kind, right? So here, kinds are typically, in most conceptualization, these things would be considered kinds. We see that not all of them, person, dog, organization, car. We have roles like student, singer, phases like living person or metropolis, which is a phase of a city, right? After you cross a populational threshold. And then we have mixed scenes like, you know, cultural heritage item that could have Mick Jagger, but also the Taj Mahal, an insurable item that could have as instance both me and my my car and my house and a painting and an event and so on, right? Now, these are all types of what is called in ontology an endurance. This is in contrast with events. Events are things which unfold in time and which cannot change, right? Endurance are things which exist in time and that can change in a qualitative way while maintaining their identity. Luciana, please.
Yes, sorry for interrupting.
No problem.
I'm thinking about the roles and the phases, no?
Yes.
Because so roles normally are linked to the external external properties of objects. So
Yes.
of kind, let's say.
Yes.
And the phases, it's very interesting because if I well understood, the phases are linked to the intrinsic properties of a kind. So are with the phases describing like situations?
Yes, in a sense, there is some sort of so suppose that you have an event, which is my life, right? My life, the life of that particular entity, Giancarlo. Yes. There will be temporal parts, which are normally, so temporal parts of my life, of that event, which are normally convex and would correspond to the life. So you could call them a kind of situation, right? And would correspond to the life, to the part of my life in which I instantiated a particular phase, right? Okay. So the example I just mentioned, child, teenager, yes. and adult, this would be temporal parts of my life, right?
Okay.
And but I mean, this example it's a bit too trivial because you have you do have constraints, right? So for example, I cannot move from being a child to being an adult without being a teenager. Once I move in this sequence, I cannot go back. So the constraints on how to move from one phase to another in the taxonomy are given by these temporal constraints of their corresponding temporal parts or temporal phases.
Okay.
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 Now, no problem. Very good question. So this notion of endurance as opposed to events, occurrences, process, and so on, are these things which can exist in time, changing their properties and while maintaining their identity. So they can suffer qualitative changes, right? And what kind of qualitative changes? This is given by the kind. So the kind of changes I can undergo and still be the same individual is given by a principle, a criterion, which is supplied by the kind person. It's because I'm a person that I cannot, split into parts, for example, and still be the same entity. If a piano falls on top of my head, I'm not a person anymore, right? So I cannot survive that kind of change, right? If I have a statue, and I make a blob out of the statue, that object ceases to exist as a statue because that particular shape is an essential property of statues. However, if I have here a lump of clay and I do this, it's still the same object because lump of clays have shapes accidentally, not essentially, right? It's accidental for the lump of clay to be shaped like Barack Obama, right? But it's essential for the statue of Barack Obama to be shaped like Barack Obama. So the kind of changes things can undergo is determined by the kinds of things they are. Now, endurance is sometimes we use the term object to refer to endurance, right? So myself, my car, my house, this computer, the University of Twente, these are all objects. However, there are endurance, which are not objects. So the idea is that objects are things which can exist in an independent way. In contrast with endurance, which are called aspects. Aspects are parasitic entities, entities which can only exist if other things exist, entities which are existentially dependent on other things, right? If you really want to have a counterpart in database design, this will be a weak entity. But I don't like to say that because a weak entity, in the way it's formulated by ER diagrams, it's a binding between primary keys. While here, what we have is an ontological notion, right? So for example, my headache can only exist if I exist. My dengue fever can only exist if I exist. My knowledge of Dutch can only exist if I exist, right? The color of the apple is existentially dependent on the apple. The color of the apple is not red. The color of the apple is contingently red. It can change. So if the apple changes from red to brown, what is changing is the color of the apple. It's something which exists, persists in time, changing in a qualitative way from red to brown, from green to red to brown, for example, but maintaining its identity is an aspect of the apple which changes, right? Things like the color and the weight, which are these parasitic entities that take their values in different points in time in a certain conceptual space, attribute value space, if you like, are called qualities. And things which are these entities that look very much like objects, but which are, again, existentially dependent on other objects, like my knowledge of Dutch or the dengue fever, or a hole in the table that can only exist if the table exists. They're called modes. One particular, very common example of mode is what is called a disposition. So for example, so my capacity to speak English is a kind of disposition, right? So it's a property that is manifested as an occurrence of an event, only certain situations. Qualities and modes are examples of what is called a monadic aspect. So it's something which depends on one single object. And then we have non-monadic aspects or relational aspects. And these are called here relators. So for example, the marriage between John and Mary can only exist if John and Mary exist. My employment with the University of Bolzano can only exist if I exist and the University of Bolzano exists. Barack Obama's mandate as president of the US can only exist if Barack Obama and the US exist, and so on. So marriage, employments, enrollments, presidential mandates, purchases, and so on. These are all examples of relators. And these things are object-like entities. They have their own properties. Right? And as I said, these categories here apply to all endurance, not only to objects, not only to independent things. So for example, the marriage between John and Mary is necessarily a marriage, but it's only contingently a marriage with full separation of assets. So it can move to a different phase and become a marriage with partial separation of assets. And it's only a marriage that's legally accepted in the Netherlands, for example. Suppose John and Mary were married in Italy, and they have to have their marriage legally accepted in the Netherlands. So being legally accepted in the Netherlands is a property of the marriage, and it's a relational property. So it's a role played by the marriage. Luciana, please.
Sorry, I didn't want to, it's unintentionally raised hand, sorry.
No problem. Okay, so endurance are either objects or aspects. Aspects can be intrinsic, monadic, or relational. And therefore, because these objects are existentially dependent on a multitude of things, it binds these things, right? As we'll see, they will play a role in explaining relations, right? Like, for example, John, we can say it's true to say that John is married to Mary because there is a marriage that binds them, right? They have their own properties, they have their own life cycle. In fact, most information systems, what they do is to manage the life cycles of relators, right? Of marriage, employments, enrollments, and presidential mandates and purchases and so on. Now, here we have a representation of a mode. So the symptom is existentially dependent on the patient. This relation here is one of existential dependence. So it's not only a cardinality constraint, but the life of this thing is embedded in the life of the patient. If the patient ceases to exist, so does the symptom. And as I said, these things can go through phase. The symptom can change from being a mild symptom to a severe symptom. So phases of the symptom, but you know, my dengue fever can become a hemorrhagic fever. And being a hemorrhagic fever is contingent for the dengue fever, but essential for the fever, right? So the fever can be asymptomatic right? But it's still the same fever. And here is an example of a relator, the treatment that binds the patient with the healthcare provider. These are not UML association classes. We'll come back to this. Again, the treatment can be an active or a suspended treatment, right? And a suspended treatment can become active again. What does that buy us? So it's about domain appropriateness engineering, right? So first we have a language here, which primitives reflect this rich system of ontological distinctions, and the grammar will reflect these ontological rules, as we'll see. So we cannot just combine these things in any possible way. So we are constrained on what kind of relations we can establish between these things, right? So for example, a relator will have to be connected via these particular types of existential dependence relations to more than one individual at the instance level. A mode will have to be connected by existential dependence to one particular endurance type, and so on. These things, this specialization relations obey certain rules, and so on. But second, please note that I'm using a number of meta properties to motivate these distinctions, right? I'm saying endurance are independent or dependent. Are dependent on one thing or multiple things. Types can either be kinds or specializations of kinds or mixins. Kinds are rigid. They classify their instance necessarily. Phases are dynamic, and the dynamic condition is an intrinsic one. Roles are dynamic, and the dynamic condition is a relational one. Mixins classify things of multiple kinds, and so on. So I'm using a number of meta properties, being rigid, being assortal, being relationally dependent, in order to define these types of types. However, these meta properties will also become methodological guidelines for deciding how the elements in my domain, my universe of discourse, should be modeled. So the first thing you get is expressivity. Why is this important? Because the same entity can instantiate multiple types, and I want to understand how to model these multiple types, right? So take this individual here. He's an instance of person, necessarily. He's also an instance of a senior citizen. And he's somehow identical to this other individual, although they have very different qualities. So there are many changes that this individual on the left suffered, but he's still identical to the individual on the right. The individual on the left is an instance of boy. The individual on the right is an instance of senior citizen. How can they be identical if the one on the left is not a senior citizen and the one on the right is not a boy? It's because there is a type that they instantiate necessarily that provides this principle of identity. In this case, the type person. This individual also instantiates the role of a singer, also instantiates the role of actor, so he can step in and out of all these different types, and he's still the same because this kind person is providing this principle of identity. We can even do counterfactual reasoning and think and consider, for example, what hadn't he dropped out? Imagine a universe in which he hadn't dropped out from the London School of Economics, and he's nowadays an economist and not a singer, right? So we can even imagine Mick Jagger in this counterfactual world as an economist, as an instance of economist, but still identical to himself. It is Mick Jagger that in that world is an economist. Why? Because he's still a person there. So my point is, take this individual. There are all these different types that the individual instantiates, right? If we look from a logical point of view, all these different types are just unary predicates. However, they are more than that. The classification relation binding Mick Jagger to person and to man, for example, is very different from the one connecting Mick Jagger, an adult person, or young boy, or economist, or singer, or British citizen, and so on. So this approach will give me a number of methodological guidelines for deciding, given my conceptualization, how each of these things should be modeled, right? So for example, if I think that person is something that is rigid and is a sortal that provides a principle of identity which is uniform for their instance, I model this as a kind. If I take that a singer, economist, British citizen, knight of the British Empire are dynamic, classify things of a unique kind, namely person, and are relational, I will model this as roles. If I consider that being an adult man or a living person is contingent, classify things of a unique kind, again, person, and that are relationally independent, so it's intrinsically motivated, I will model this as a phase. And if I have a type that classify things of multiple kinds, I'll have this as a mixin, like cultural heritage item, or physical entity, or insurable item, and so on. One direct synthetical consequence is that mixins are abstract classes, so they cannot be directly instantiated. Now, another thing that we can gain with this. Let's come back to the problem of interoperability. Suppose I have these two systems now that we saw in the beginning, right? But now they are modeled using this language. And here I have a person can be living or deceased, a transplant with a relator. A transplant can only exist if there are donors, donees, and surgeons. These are different roles played by people in the scope of a transplant. And here I have this other model in which I have the notion of human being, with a kind. Here, person is a type of human being that it's cognitively capable. So if I'm brain dead in the second domain, if I have a brain accident and I'm not responsible for my acts anymore, I'm not legally a person in the second domain. So being a person here is a phase of human beings. I have surgeon as a role. I have a medical license, which is a kind of relator, right? It's a kind of contract between, let's say, a society and a jurisdiction and a surgeon issued by a medical certification body, which is a sub-kind of organization. And here I have a transplant. It's not a relator. A transplant is a type of transplant. So the instances of transplant here are specialization of transplant, right? So this thing says this surgeon given this surgeon has a medical license that allows him to perform these instances of transplant. An instance of transplant are specializations of transplant on the left, are the cornea transplant and heart transplants and so on, right? So by looking at this, by having a model that renders these ontological distinctions explicit, I can immediately see that they are not identical. So person on the right is not identical to person on the left. The relation here is one of specialization. In fact, person on the left is probably identical to human being on the right. And transplant on the left is not identical to transplant on the right, right? The relation is one of instantiation. So the instance of transplants are instances of transplants on the right. This seems like it might, seem to you like something easy, but this, as I mentioned during the break, this can get very tricky. Let's take this very simple concept of person, right? What does person mean in different domains? It can mean a human being. It can mean a legally recognized human being. So a human being that's legally recognized as such by a given jurisdiction. So something of which citizen would be a subtype, right? Someone who has a birth certificate and legally exists as a person. Third, cognitively capable human beings. So someone who's cognitively responsible for their acts. That's a different sense of person. And then, of course, you have the notion of legal person that would include not only human beings, but also organizations, corporations, collectives, and so on. So I want you to pause for a second and think, how would you model these 4 different senses of person? What kind of ontological category would you use to stereotype, to represent these different types of types? Again, one particular individual like myself, I'm an instance of these 4 things. Actually, many of us, or actually all of us all of us here are instances of these 4 different things. But their extension is not necessarily identical, and the relation between all these different types is not one of identity. So how do I model this? These notions of roles and phases or states and mixins, they have existed in the object-oriented modeling literature for many decades, but they were defined or they were characterized in a very informal way. Here we have a formal definition of all these different things. So here is one way to think about this, that given my conceptualization, I will take human beings to be a kind of thing. So every human being is necessarily a human being. That being a legally recognized human being is a role played by human beings, by things of this kind, number one, when I'm recognized by a particular state, when I have a birth certificate or a social security number, it depends on the conceptualization, right? Cognitively capable human beings is a phase of human beings, right? Maybe it's a phase of human beings that play this particular role, depending on the conceptualization. And being a legal person is a mixing that would be specialized both by human beings, maybe cognitively capable human beings, because legal person are agents who can participate in legal relations, right? So maybe only legally recognized, cognitively capable human beings are legal persons in the sense of 4, and so are certain types of organizations, active organizations, for example. Again, I'm integrating here 4 models with one concept, and it's already not trivial. And already I can think of 5 different interpretations of these things. And here's a model that puts all of them together. So legal person here, it's one choice, it's a category, so a rigid mixing, that's a supertype of people and organization. People can be living people, and they can play the role of legally recognized person. The relation is not shown here. And I'm saying that a cognitively capable living person is it's a living person that is legally recognized, right? Maybe in a different conceptualization, someone else would make explicit that only these cognitively capable living people are legal persons, and so on. And this would be a different model. And again, it's as simple as it gets, right? In terms of models that I'm integrating. These are 4 models with one class. Let me give you another example. This is a classical example. This was published by in a paper in the 80s by Richard Fikes, Hector Levesque, and Ron Brackman. And in this paper, they asked this question. I mean, these are the guys that define the semantics of description logics, right? Which is the grandfather. I mean, the first description logics was the result of the PhD thesis of Ron Brackman in the end of the 70s. And it was called KL1, Knowledge Language 1. So all description logics, including OWL, are descendants of KL1. And in this paper in the 80s, they asked this question. They say, how many kinds of rock do we have here? Right? And they come to the conclusion that this is a very dangerous question to ask, that we shouldn't ask this question, because we can have this proliferation, this a combinatorial explosion of all possible combinations we can have among these things, right? But this is because they were thinking only in terms of logics. They were taking types to be the notion of type to be a synonym to the notion of a predicate, a logical predicate. Now, with the kind of tools in the toolbox that we have now, this is actually a very easy question to answer. How many kinds of rock do we have here? Geologists will tell you 3: igneous rock, sedimentary rock, and metamorphic rock. Therefore, the notion of rock is a mixing that classifies things of multiple kinds. Being a gray sedimentary rock, I will take here to be a phase, supposing that rocks can change their color, that being gray is just accidental for sedimentary rocks, and also for igneous rocks. So being large and being gray, I'm taking to be accidental for igneous rocks, because they can change size, right? With erosion, they can become small, which means, and being a pet metamorphic rock is a role played by a rock once it has a kind of pet relation with someone else. Imagine if I use a metamorphic rock as a paperweight, and I have an emotional attachment to the metamorphic rock, I use it as a pet. So it's a role, right? Played by a metamorphic rock because of this relation with someone that considers the metamorphic rock as a pet. These two things now become what is called a phase mixing. It's a mixing that refactors supertypes, phases of entities of different kinds, right? So being a gray rock is accidental for all their instances, and it classifies things of multiple kinds, namely sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks. We're talking about distinctions among types of types or categories of types. We also have distinctions among different types of relations or categories of relations. So take this relation of existential dependence, which is called characterization between a mode or a quality and an object. This relation is non-analyzable. It's kind of primitive. As soon as the symptom exists, this relation is established because it's part of the very definition of a mode that it's existentially dependent on something else. Contrast this relation, this is also true for these relations of mediation, which is our kind of non-functional existential dependence relation, right? As soon as the treatment exists, the things it depends on must exist, and the relation is established between them. So it's a kind of primitive, non-analyzable relation. This is different from this one, for example. Suppose that a patient is more critical than another patient. This relation is reducible to intrinsic property of the patients, namely, how serious are their symptoms, right? So this relation is a relation that is derivable, reducible to intrinsic properties. Another example, suppose I say that I'm taller than my daughter, or I'm taller than someone else, right? Than the person walking right now on the street. This is a relational predicate, but there is no real relation between myself and this person on the street. This relation is again reducible to intrinsic property of myself and this person, namely our heights, right? In fact, the relation is established as soon as we exist. If someone has just been born while I'm uttering this sentence, I'm taller than this person now. There is nothing else which is required but our intrinsic properties. This is very different from this relation, for example. So if John is married to Mary, it's not because of intrinsic properties of John and Mary. If John is treated by a particular medical provider, it's not due to the sheer existence of the John and the healthcare provider. If Giancarlo works for the University of Twente and not for the University of Trento, there is something there that makes this relationship true in the first case and not in the second. So these relations, which are the most common relations in domain models, which are called material relations, in order for this relationship to exist, something else needs to exist which binds the relata. In this case, the treatment. itself, as we will see. And this will have a very important influence in correctness of models. So again, here we have a tiny ontology of relations. Relations can be internal, so non-analyzable, primitive, which are, for example, relations of existential dependence, like the one between a mode and its host, or between a relator and its multiple hosts. And we have the so-called grounded relations, or relations which are grounded on other things. Comparative formal relations are grounded on intrinsic properties of the relata. Material relations are grounded on relators. So here again, we have an explicit representation of this relator. And the whole discussion about interoperability will also manifest itself here. So take, for example, this relation of being treated in. We agreed, I hope we agree that this is a material relation. It is true that a patient is treated in a healthcare provider if there is a treatment connecting in which they both participate, right? But now look at these cardinality constraints, which are used in the normal representation of associations or relations in conceptual modeling, right? In domain modeling like R, UML, OWL, and so on. How do I interpret this? There are many, many possible ways. So if I say that a patient is treated in by one too many healthcare providers, and the healthcare provider treats one too many patients, how do we interpret this? One interpretation is this one. Given a treatment, there is exactly one patient, exactly one healthcare provider, but both of them can participate in many treatments. Another interpretation is, given a treatment, there are possibly many patients, so collective treatments, only one healthcare provider, but they both can participate in many treatments. Given a treatment, there is only one patient, so treatments are bound to single patients, but there could be many healthcare providers that provide service in the same treatments, and they all can possibly participate in many treatments. Given a treatment, you can have collective treatments, multiple providers, and they all can participate in many treatments. Given a treatment, there are many patients, possibly many patients, many healthcare providers, but they can only participate in one treatment, and so on. These are all possible interpretations of those cardinality constraints. This gets much worse once you have non-binary relations, right? So for example, this relation between surgeon, donor, and donee, which will be a ternary relation. How do you interpret this? You have the combinatorial explosion of interpretations, because again, given a transplant, you have only one donor, only one donee, and only one surgeon, but they all can participate in many, and so on, right? So this thing explodes. It gets worse with this arity of the relation. Actually, in relations which are non-binary, these cardinality constraints become completely useless for a different technical reason. They all have to be zero, because this is a mistake, right? People write this in this way, saying, if I'm a donor, it's because I donated something to at least one person, and there should be at least one surgeon performing this surgery. That's why they put one here and one here. But that's not the semantics of this in UML, for example. In UML, it says, if there is a one here, what you're saying is that given the cross product of these two classes, there is a functional mapping to this class. In other words, if I take any combination of donor and donee, there should be a surgeon, which is not true, because it's not the case that every donor donated to every donee, right? So if I donated to John, but not to Mary, the pair John-Mary will not result in a surgeon here, because I never donated anything to Mary. So it means that in relations with arity higher than 2, these cardinality constraints have to be 0 to many, which is the absence of a constraint, that it doesn't constrain anything, right? So what I'm saying here is that this normal notation is insufficient to disambiguate multiple interpretations, and this causes many problems of semantic interoperability. And this is necessarily the case for all material relations and only for material relations. So for example, if I have a relation between symptoms that saying symptoms precede zero to many symptoms, right? In the sense that they have to have happened before in time. There is no other way of interpreting this. If a symptom is preceded by one too many symptom, it means that there are one too many symptoms that happened before that symptom, and so on, right? There is no ambiguity. But every time you have a material relation, you will necessarily have ambiguity, because what you are doing is you are collapsing in one notation two different types of constraints, of cardinality constraints, what's called single tuple and multiple tuple cardinality constraints. Basically, what you're doing is, because you are hiding this thing here, you are there are 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 cardinality constraints, which are so 8 variables which are collapsed into 4. Actually, you have 12 variables. I'll come back to that in a minute. You have 12 variables which are collapsed into 4 variables. So you necessarily have ambiguity, right? Notice that this is the original model. Here, I'm making explicit that given a treatment, I have only one patient and only one healthcare provider. So if I'm assisted by several healthcare providers, these are different treatments in this domain. But both patient and healthcare provider can participate in many treatments. Now, notice if I change these cardinalities here radically, so now a treatment can be a collective treatment and with multi-provider treatment, but they can only participate in one treatment. So this will be a relation with a completely different semantics. If I change this, nothing changes in these cardinality constraints here. Here's a third option. Everything is the same in this if you only have this snippet of the domain model, right? Now, what changes are these things here? And this is important. I mean, that's why I said this is not association class. In association class in UML, the instance of the association class is the instance of the relation. They are the same entity. The instance of the association class is basically the tuple, maybe plus an additional object identifier. Here, these are different things. This is a set of tuples which are derived from this relator. So if there is a pair binding John and the healthcare provider, it is because there is a treatment that mediates them. And what these cardinality constraints here are saying is the following. Given a treatment, how many pairs can I derive here? 1, right? Because given a treatment, there is just one patient and one healthcare provider. Now here, given a treatment, I can derive many pairs, because a patient can be treated by many healthcare providers in that treatment, and a healthcare provider can treat many patients in the same treatment. That's why it's one too many. This cardinality constraint here is something else. This cardinality constraint is telling you, given a tuple like John and healthcare provider 1, how many treatments can exist between them, right? For example, how many times can John be treated by the same healthcare provider in different treatments? Many times. Okay. Again, these are all different cardinality constraints that are collapsed in one single representation. Now, again, look at these 2 models. I'm coming back to the point of semantic interoperability. Look at these 2 models. These are 2 models which have a very different semantics for this treated in relation. Again, here treatments are individual, here treatments are collective, right? They can have both many patients and many healthcare providers in the same treatment. But if you look at the traditional notation, they are identical. They are exactly the same. They collapse into the same representation. So any person looking at these 2 models, if I just have the part here at the bottom, I would conclude that you are talking about the same thing, while you're not. These relations have very different semantics. Third point is, what does that, so I'm giving you many points of answering the question of what does that buy us, right? is this notion of having kind of ontological correctness by design, because you have rules, constraints on how these things can be combined. As I said, it's part of the definition of something like a role, for example, that you have this constraints here. For example, all instances of a given role are of the same kind, right? For example, all students are people. All instances of role instantiate that type only contingently. No student is necessarily a student. Instance of a kind instantiate a role when participating in a relational context. For example, instance of people instantiate a role student when enrolled in an educational institution, right? And there are other constraints, foreign constraints, which are much less obvious, like this one, that a role cannot be a supertype of a rigid type. And I can show to you that if you break this rule, you run into a logical contradiction. Your model becomes logically inconsistent. Let's take an example. Imagine that I take the role customer and I put it as a supertype of person, right? And you might think that people would never do this, but this happens basically all the time. I actually took this from a UML book because people want to do this. People want to say that customers can be either people or organizations, right? Now, what is the problem? Suppose that, this is the formal proof in 5 slides. Suppose that the semantics of specialization is this, right? If person is a specialization of customer, every instance of person is an instance of customer. So if X is an instance of person, then X is an instance of customer. However, because customer is anti-rigid, is dynamic, it means that everything which is a customer can cease to be a customer. So every instance of customer in world W can cease to be a customer in world W prime. However, because person is rigid, if something is a person, that's necessarily a person in all possible worlds in which it exists, right? So if X is a person in W, it's also a person in W prime. But everything which is a person is a customer, given the semantics of specialization. That means that according to this model, X is and isn't at the same time an instance of customer in W prime, which is a logical contradiction. So every time you take an anti-rigid type and put as a supertype of a rigid type, you run into a logical contradiction. So taking these constraints that you have related to each of these ontological notions, I'm just giving you the example of role. I can build syntactical rules in my language that would proscribe these models from being acceptable, right? So I cannot have a role without a kind, that without a subsumming kind that will give the identity for the instance of these roles. So no free floating roles. I cannot have a role as a supertype of a kind, and I cannot have a role without being defined in a relational condition. So I cannot say that a student is enrolled in zero to many education institutions, because being enrolled in at least one education institution is part of the very definition of what is to be a student. So I can build a tool that will check this. So if I take here, it's an example of a tool that is aware of these constraints. So here, for example, I define a functional brain, and I'm saying that this is a phase, right? You don't know phase of what, that's why it's gray. Once I connect that to brain, it gets an identity. So functional brains are brains. And so are non-functional brains. Different phases of a brain. Now, notice that there are only options which are conformant to the rules of the language, right? The only things that could be a supertype of a phase are other sortals. Here again, if I check the model now, employer doesn't have an identity. The tool will check that and show you that what is missing there is a kind providing an identity for that role. So I can build a language that embeds in its grammar all these different constraints. Again, ontologically motivated semantic constraints that give rise to syntactical constraints. So these models won't compile, if you like. But actually, we can do better than this. So instead of thinking of the things that we cannot do, right, we should realize that given the semantics of these modeling elements, of these primitives, there are few things we can do. So because of the 4 constraints that I just told you about rows, right? Rows can only appear in the model in this particular set, in this particular cluster of concepts, in this particular pattern, right? So for example, here, a row must eventually specialize one unique kind, and it must be defined in the scope of a relationship such that the opposite association end of that relation has a minimum cardinality constraint with at least 1, right? Which defines this relational condition. So here is an instantiation of this row pattern. Patients are living people who are treated by healthcare providers. The same for phases. If I have a phase of a given kind, because you can always move out of that phase, but you cannot move out of that kind, you have to move into another phase of the same kind. So phases are defined in what is called phase partitions, so a disjoint complete generalization set, which eventually specialize one unique kind. Here are 2 examples of instance of this phase pattern. We also saw this relator pattern. So every time I have a material relation, I would have a relator with this existential dependence relation plus this derivation relation with these disambiguating constraints. And here I have an instance of that. There are other patterns which are a bit more sophisticated, like, for example, one that we would need to address this problem here. We saw that we cannot, I mean, this was a problem that was discussed for many years in conceptual modeling, domain modeling. How do you model a role that can be played by instance of multiple kinds? This is a problem pattern. This is called the problem of roles with multiple disjoint allowed types. As we saw, we cannot do this, right? So if customer cannot be a common supertype of person and organization, because we run into a logical contradiction. So if person cannot be a common supertype, can it be a common subtype? No, because as we saw, all kinds are mutually disjoint, which means their intersection is empty, right? So this model implies that there are no customers. You can never instantiate a customer because every customer would be both a person and an organization, and there is nothing that is both a person and an organization. So how do you solve this problem? You solve this problem by realizing that customer here is not a role, it's a mixin. The whole problem is that it's not a role, it's not a sortal, it's not one of those shadows that is contained by one particular, in the region of one particular kind. It crosses the boundaries of multiple kinds, right? It's a mixin, and it's contingent. No customer is necessarily a customer. It classifies things of multiple kinds, and it's relationally dependent. In order to be a customer, you have to buy a product or a service from a supplier, right? How do you solve this? Well, you realize that because this is a mixin, I could specialize this type, having a number of classes that are sortals, that exhaust the extension of this type. In this case, it's very easy, right? I take customers, I look at the extension, let's say, and I will see, well, there are 2 regions here, the region of people and the region of organization. So there is a specialization of customer, which are those customers which are people, and those customers which are organizations. And this can happen, this will solve this problem every single time. Imagine if you have crime weapon, right? Again, this is a role mixing. Why? Many things of multiple kinds can be crime weapons. So guns and knives and rocks and books and poison, potions and many different things, right? In order to be a crime weapon, it has to be used to commit a crime, so it's relational, and nothing is necessarily a crime weapon. Again, you take crime weapon, specialize in all these different subtypes, all of which are rows. And here again, you have a pattern. Every time you have a row mixin, you're going to specialize this in multiple rows, each of them taking an identity from one different kind. And here you have the relational condition. And here is an example. It's a variant of that model. Here I have the row mixing customer, which is specializing in personal customer, which are living people, corporate customers, which are active organization, and a customer is something that participates in an economic agreement with a supplier. And then I can build a tool that builds models by connecting these patterns. So instead of just putting together a number of classes and relations and so on, I instantiate these patterns of the language. So here I'm saying a deceased person is a phase of person. If it is a phase, that should be at least another phase. And then I instantiate this. I'll say that, an organization is a kind, active organization is a phase of organizations, of things of that kind. And the other, if it is a phase, there should be at least another phase or an extinct organization. And here we have this more sophisticated row mixing pattern, in which I say, for example, that personal customer is a role played by living people, that corporate customer is a role played by active organization, and that the relator in this case is a service contract, and the role on the other end is the role of supplier, which again played by active organization. And then voila. So we basically instantiate these three patterns and create these models. It's a very simple model, but it's not a trivial model. Actually, many people would get this model wrong because of this, how to connect this customer with the multiple kinds of things which can instantiate that role, right? So the important message in this part is, when you have a language that is not ontologically neutral, what happens is that the primitives of that language will not be free to associate in whatever way. In fact, if you have an ontology in the background, so if you have an ontological theory in the background, what happens is that the micro theories constituting that foundational theory will manifest themselves as patterns in this language. Again, if you have a row mixing, a number of things must co-occur with a row mixing in order for this to be an ontologically valid model. So what happens is that the language itself becomes a pattern language. So instead of having low granularity primitives like classes or relations and attributes, the actual modeling primitives of a language like this are patterns, and you build models by putting patterns together. So in fact, what we did was to show this. We formalized the grammar of OntoUML as a pattern grammar, as a set of graph rewriting rules in which you show that all models can be built by putting these patterns together.
Giancarlo, just a reminder that we are in our schedule in the time of questions.
Yes.
You want to stop now or maybe in a couple of slides, I'm not sure.
Let me just finish this part and I would just mention something else still regarding patterns, and then we can make a break for questions. Now, regarding, I think that was Reagan that asked this question regarding these part-whole relations here. So in UML, you would have a problem differentiating the relation that you have with your heart and with your brain, right? Because this would both collapse to these cardinality constraints. So you're saying here, every person must have a heart, every heart must be the heart of a person, every human heart, of course, every person must have a brain, and every human brain must be connected to exactly one person, right? However, these two relations are very different from an ontological point of view because they imply different types of dependence. In the first case, what you have is what's called generic dependence. So what you're saying is every person must have a heart, but it doesn't have to be the same heart in every possible world, right? People have as parts instance of the class heart. Hearts must be parts of instance of the class person, but it doesn't have to be the same person. While, and again, this is dependent on conceptualization. I'm not saying this is always true. Suppose that in my conceptualization, I want to say that brains are not just related to people by generic dependence, but by specific dependence. So what I'm saying is that brains are an essential part of people. So every person must have that specific brain in every possible world in which the person exists. And in this case, that brains are also inseparable part of people, in the sense that brains must be part of that particular person in every situation in which they exist. So a kind of existential dependence in this example, both from the whole to the part and from the part to the whole, right? In this case, there should be some relation between the identity of the person and the identity of the brain, for example. Like, you know, a brain transplant would be a body transplant because your identity is connected to your brain in this example. So the language would make this model distinctions not only in types of entities, but in types of relationships. And this is important because of another thing, like, you know, partial relations are taken very often to be transitive relations, right? And it's important to understand transitivity plus existential dependence, because if you have a chain of parthood, of essential parthood, if you destroy the parts, this propagates in this chain, destroying the whole, right? But then you have to understand which are the parts of the whole. And by transitivity, it should be the parts of the parts of the parts of the parts of the whole, right? If it is true that part-whole relations are always transitive, however, they are not. So for example, suppose Giancarlo is part of the conceptual modeling group of the University of Bolzano, and the conceptual modeling group of the University of Bolzano is part of the University of Bolzano. So Giancarlo is part of the University of Bolzano. The left hemisphere of my brain is part of my brain, which is part of myself. So the left hemisphere is part of myself. However, my brain is part of myself and I'm part of the conceptual modeling group, but my brain is not part of the conceptual modeling group, right? So transitivity holds in certain contexts, but not in others. How do we solve this? Again, in a language which is pattern-based, we can solve this by proposing patterns that would isolate the context of transitivity. And that's exactly what we did. So these are patterns that would detect exactly in which, that would delimit the context of transitivity, where you can infer certain transitive relations, right? So for example, in the case A, B, and C, you can infer the dashed line, the dashed derived part-whole relations. And when you have the cases of D and E, you can actually block that inference. So for example, here I have the mitral valve, which is part of the human heart, which is part of the person. A musician is a person, and the musician is part of the orchestra. So you want to know, is the mitral valve part of the musician and the human heart are part of the orchestra? In the former case, you can derive that because it's an instance of the case B. And in the second case, you can block that because it's an instance of D, right? And of course, this is a trivial example, but imagine that you have multiple levels of specialization, right? And multiple levels of combined part-whole relations. Then you need a tool to infer the relations, right? That should be inferred, and that will block the relations that shouldn't be there. Okay, I think this is a good point for questions, and then for another.